in this committee. So we know that Robin and Kim are members of the committee, but I left that last meeting saying they did not have a vote.
No, and all the committee members have one vote each.
Okay.
Let's see it here.
It is in
Okay.
the resolution.
I'll be right up.
Do you recall that discussion we had, it was a couple of sessions ago, I think, at the time, I think Amy and Calvin were thinking that was not appropriate.
Awesome.
I'm only bringing it up because this would be the time to address it formally.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
but I don't recall why it would be appropriate, or what's the alternative suggestion of all members have one vote?
It was because some are insiders, maybe, or to speak, versus committee members. I mean,
It would be like, we take the same role
Yeah.
with the board meeting,
Yeah.
that we provide the information to you, but you make the
it's
suggestions to the board.
a separation.
Right? But how does everyone here having one vote make a difference of what goes to, is the recommendation that the committee is bringing to the board?
But I think generally this is an independent outside committee, right? Sort of.
It's a standing committee is
So
the
then you have
definition.
employees who are also on the committee. Typically, I don't see that. You have employees on an outside board or advisory board, who actually have voting capability. Voting rights.
So is the issue of voting or membership in the committee?
No,
No, voting
Voting.
rights. He's talking about voting rights.
voting.
but that would change him and Robin's role here. They would simply be supplying information into
Yeah.
the committee. They're not really committee members. In that case, if you don't have a vote.
Mhm.
I will tell you personally, because I think the final decisions are made at the board level. I actually don't have a problem with those two guys having a vote at this level of committee, but I think we should probably clarify that.
Yeah, okay.
You know, that's not an unimportant, piece to this.
So what's the the revised or suggested?
What's it
change
say, what's
in
it
the
say now?
recommend-
What's it say now? Where's the voting?
Where is it?
Wait, on section 2, it says the finance committee shall be comprised of at least 7 members. 4 of those should be treasurer, finance and general manager, the remaining. So they are listed, at least as this is written today, as members of this committee, not as suppliers of information to this committee.
Yes, but
They're part of this committee. So
Right,
then the second question would be, if we have that, should they also have a vote like any other member of the committee? Or is there 2 classes of committee members?
okay.
I would be on the idea that they're voting.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. In what?
I would be supportive of the idea that Robin and Kim are voting. It's not as if they're voting again later on as part of the board or anything like that. So
Okay.
Well, given the amount of input that we received from them, why would they not have a vote? I mean, I'm gonna look at it from that perspective. They're an integral part of the school. And
Well,
we
you know,
voted
I
them
mean,
with stuff.
I agree with you. I think that, let's say that Kim was nefarious. I'm not suggesting she is.
The violence situation.
She could tell us something and we believe it and then say, I never,
No, we have him right and we catch her.
Yeah, I just think, that's a practical matter.
You can't get away, kid.
I just think it contrary. I think it's they're advisors, they're critical advisors to the community as opposed to voting. They're part of the community, can be part of it, but not a voting.
So with
But
that,
I just don't see that.
with that statement, because they're advisory, so the committee is supposed to be an advisory committee as well. I think Mike Hoffman is going to say you're not technically supposed to be voting. You're maybe a consensus to provide to the board because you can't take action on anything, and a vote would be an action. So I think that might be something
Okay.
we need to ask Mike about, because it is more of an advisory committee.
And to that point, I actually don't see anything in here formally about a vote,
Yeah,
period.
I saw some.
There is-
There's
It
a
was
vote,
not in here.
there's a
No.
vote to
There is in
remove
the-
people.
Sure is not.
In the
That's what's-
discussion subsequently, April of 23 or something
Oh,
like
yeah,
that.
that's the other.
There was something
Right.
that, and I know that I had included it in an update of who's who and, kind of the outline, and everybody gets one vote.
Yes, I do remember seeing that.
Right, so as the correct outcome, this is a standing committee by the original resolution. And if that defines or limits what we can or can't do, I think the standing committee was always to be advisory to the board because we have no authority to act per se. Only the board can make the final decisions. But we could be voting to make a recommendation, or we could be conversing with no serious objection to make the recommendation
The thing is,
and leave voting out of it, leave it silent.
but the policy talks about what we do as a committee, although I think the policy talks about investment committee. I'm not sure what the investment committee is, because this is the finance committee, right?
Well, that's
Goes back-
our next
goes
step.
back to
I
the-
think you gotta.
Goes back to the definition, I'm telling you.
This.
Drives me
You know.
nuts.
I'm
But,
jumping ahead, because it's
But,
not- that language is not in this aspect.
but I don't think I think you look at this policy in connection with committee and what we do, right? Because I think this policy talks about making decisions, right? And people who make decisions are the finance committee or the investment committee, or
Mhm.
so we actually make decisions.
Yes. In that document, if you're following that document,
Yeah,
there is
that's-
decision-making power in that document.
Right, but that's us,
Mhm,
people who vote.
mhm.
So you have to, I think you have to get together. And as you go through it and redraft this, I don't look at this in isolation.
So the question would be, is this committee an advisory committee to the board? Or is this committee a decision-making body, or does it have some things that are decision-making and some things that are advisory?
It's advisory to the board.
Okay,
It's a standing committee, if that's important. But it's definitely advisory to the board, and somewhere in here, it says that we advise to the
Section one.
board, but the board makes the decisions.
so the only conflict of interest, I just off the top of my head, I can think of is if we're talking about, should we raise the compensation of the employees here by 20% in a given year, and Kim
I would abstain.
and Robin vote yes. I'm a little bit joking, but everything you do has. But there's a lot of things in here where Robin and Kim are going to be the knowledge holders of that,
Yes.
and they should have an input in that. So it's
It's no different than any board meeting, or any board you put together that has, the outside directors and then the internal folks who are coming in and making presentations, all, we've all been on boards, right? We all have people who are insiders who come make presentations. It's the outside folks who make the decisions, ultimate decisions, are responsible for that.
I'm sympathetic to that to a point. I do feel like they're not outside people to this committee. I feel like they're
Very integral
a
part.
very integral part of this committee. So I think in this case, it's a little different than having, let's say, UBS come in and do an investment presentation, then leave, and we decide as a committee what we want to do with what information we just heard. By being insiders, Robin and Kim are, in many cases, are going to be the deep seat of the knowledge of something we're voting on, and their opinion probably matters a lot.
I agree 100%. I'm just saying that my vast experience in participating in boards, insiders who are coming to make presentations, they have the vast knowledge, right? They know intimately what's going on in the operations. They convey that to the directors. The directors then think about it and decide accordingly, but they're not a director, right? They have the knowledge, and they're sharing that knowledge.
How do you want to resolve this? Do you want to take a vote here, or do you want to? With the best
Can I
practice,
vote or?
And I think one last question is that, I don't think you should do this in isolation, because I think you have to look at the policy.
Well, I think that's why, I
Yeah.
don't want to speak for Richard, I think that's why he's bringing us all up at the
That's
same
absolutely
time.
right.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely, but when you look at this, this policy talks about decisions that this committee makes.
yes, yeah.
It's a part of the whole.
Yeah.
But it makes it going to the policy, the investment policy. What I'm remembering, perhaps inaccurately, is that it names the board, the general manager making decisions. And I don't remember the policy engaging or relating to any financial committee.
That's a problem, because I think when we look at this,
Yes, whereas if
This
you
will
change, but you change, change it. All the places where there's board or, it's the financial committee will advise or, assist in the board in making investment decisions.
okay, I read this, general manager, plays in the finance committee, investment committee, whatever we want to call ourselves, not general manager, and maybe the board wants us to be decision maker, or
I think eventually the board ought to have a finance investment committee that's active and directs this money. Rather than relying necessarily on Robin, no offense, but I'm trying to sell him Bob's new crypto company. And I think where this maybe ought to go is this finance committee resolves these documents over time, but eventually becomes the finance/investment committee and directs it and
That's kind of the direction where we're going.
that's where, so,
Because if you're gonna be talking about UBS, you're falling right into what you're saying.
yeah, but directs rather than advises the board to do that.
And
Actually, the committee's taking action.
Yeah, the
Mhm.
committee is an advisory.
And
I think it's important that the committee is an advisory as opposed to a power center,
that's correct.
so to speak,
Right.
because the board is the one authorized to make decisions
That's right.
by charter and whatever, and delegates resources such as the finance committee, the mitigation committee,
Based on
whatever.
the information given them.
So we're advising and how we reach an advisory statement is what's the first key. Is it, we all have one vote, we all have a half a vote? Is it no serious objection? And the presentation goes forward.
Mhm.
Or, and the presentation can be, board, we've looked at this, we've discussed it, and there are three options, and here are the three options, and you're gonna have to make a decision. And we say, okay, we recommend option one, but you may feel that two or three is also a possibility. But we're not authorized to finalize that decision. We're authorized to investigate and, figure out starting from the architecture, the framework to the investment documents and so on. What is our advice to the board?
So for DMAC, that, the board member for, they have the different committees. The finance committee does come in and say suggested of the finance committee and other options we talked about for the board to review. So they don't actually make decisions, they're just,
But they'll say this is what we
yeah,
think.
this is our suggestion,
Right.
but we also talked about these things that we think might still work.
Just give them options.
And in reading over the minutes, it does say, and make recommendations.
Yeah.
Or formulate recommendations.
Mhm.
And it says, each of the 7 to 9 members gets 1 vote. That's what was in the minutes.
Yeah, and the original resolution many, many years ago talks about twice, someplace around here. But you know, this is not, this can be changed, right? I mean, we're here to say what makes sense, you know, for the committee. Should this committee make those decisions based on its expertise? I mean, be frank, if you go to the board meetings at BPW, finance stuff is just passed over. I mean, finance is like 10 seconds. It's basically Kim going up there and saying,
Here's where we are.
here's where we are, 15 seconds, 30, literally probably what, 2 minutes presentation? That's it.
Yeah.
I ask
That's not what
questions
their
now.
expertise is.
What's that?
What'd you say, Bob?
I said, I ask questions now and they like, why are we doing this?
Look, everybody's got different organizations. So I'm on the board of the Children's Beach House. The finance committee there will make the recommendation to the board, but because the board proper has a lot of confidence in the finance committee, they basically always accept the recommendations. So we do asset allocation recommendations, spending policy recommendations, but we decide and vote within the finance committee what our recommendation is going to be to the board. So.
And you vote as opposed to.
And we vote as a
no
group.
objection.
No, we voted formally as a group. Yeah.
Okay,
And then the treasurer, in my case, you know, when I was the treasurer, I would present the results to the board and they would vote. And, you know, if they didn't have confidence more broadly in the finance committee, there might be a lot more challenge. But frankly, a lot of the people in there don't have any expertise in finance. So they're looking for, you know, that expertise. That's
That's why
why
it
the
is-
committee's put together in the first place.
And I think that's how I've seen this
Yep.
put together, was the same way that Mike just said, that this committee, you have knowledgeable people in that finance field, and they make the recommendation. Or they vote to make the recommendation to the board. And normally at that point, that decision is easier to make, the board make, because of the knowledge that the finance committee has.
There's another point, there's a variety of ways to do this, and see that. One way is that the committee has authorization to make those decisions. Keep minutes, and the minutes are presented to the board. Right, that's how it's done. The decisions are done, but they're made, but those minutes are kept and given to the board.
Yep.
Which is different than the board making decision.
All right, but I would think that Mike Hoffman, if we asked him, would say he'd prefer we vote about it.
Have it on record.
You need
Yeah.
a consensus in order to move it forward in some sense.
I'm sorry.
If we have this committee and we're here for our expertise. Okay, the concept is that when we make a decision here, that we just pass it forward, that's it. Why would
Yeah.
this be any different than any other committee? Except for what this committee is. I mean, you made a statement that when when you have your board meetings, and they just kind of skim over it, because they're depending on us to know. And they don't have that, they don't have finance backgrounds.
Not all of them.
That's right.
Alan, would your view on change on Kim and Robin voting, if this group was going to present its recommendation to the board, but the board was going to make the final decision versus this group making the final decision?
Let me try to answer that. Today's board is a guy who's great at nuclear power plants. A guy who knows all about sewage systems. Richard was in construction, I was, in manufacturing. that's not, Barbara was in, basically health, safety and remediation. I guess if you need to know why the nuclear power plant isn't working, Barbara became the spokesman. That's not finance expertise. So what this committee or its subsequent futures become is important, and should have some collection of financing. Now, there's nothing that says the future board won't have, you know, a finance wizard on there. But even then, he or she is one of 5. So I think a formal recommendation to the board, you know, is because the next person they're looking for is an electrical wizard. Frankly,
Yeah, I don't want to diminish the fact that Kim and Sharon are integral part of this, right? They have with great knowledge and they're helping us and they're sharing that knowledge with us. We couldn't do this without them, quite frankly. I'm just saying that from a voting perspective, we're making the decisions. I think they should be part of the committee. I'm just saying that they're non-voting members of the committee.
If we're making a decision, but if we're making a recommendation, does that change your view?
We're making recommendations.
It makes any difference. So it doesn't make any difference to you one way or another.
Yeah.
Okay.
But if we're voting, if we're taking, if we are the first, the entity that is making the final decision on from a finance perspective, then I think it's, you know, it's us that have the votes. And clearly, you know, Kim and Sharon are part of the
Especially Kim and Robin.
Robin,
were-
yeah.
Kim and Rob, I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah,
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Kim, Rob, sorry, Rob.
So we should take a vote on this. Question is Robin and Kim vote on? Instead of a vote or not?
I would
Yeah,
say
yeah,
abstain.
But
They were
again,
probably
Can we
prefer not.
being said that we get the
I
vote?
just think that they're.
They
Would it be worth
prefer
asking
not to.
Blair? I mean, Sharon articulated a pretty interesting view. Would it be worth asking Mike Hoffman, or do you want to make an executive decision, or how do you want to?
And what are we deciding now?
Whether or not they are a member.
When,
No,
when-
whether
Voting.
Kim and Robin have a vote
Voting.
when we're making a recommendation to the
Correct.
board.
is there any objection to the financial manager and the general manager being members of this committee? First of all,
No, no, I don't think so. That's just my voting perspective, yes.
okay, but
Yes, but your question is,
okay.
no,
And the reason that they shouldn't have a vote is what?
because we're making this ultimate decision.
But we is the committee, 9, 8, 7 people are the committee. Why are we discriminating against 2 of the members? What's different that their vote shouldn't be counted or recognized? That's what I'm trying to understand or clarify. Because the board, members of the board is a collection of political voting, having very little to do with whether they have a financial background or electric or nuclear. It's whatever
yeah, whoever's popular
yeah,
and campaign.
and and then out of that political group of 5, which is, you know, half of the board at every 3 years, and the other half the other 3 years. That 5 members decides who's treasurer, who's president, who's vice president, who's secretary. Who's assistant treasurer. And that's, who knows, it's whatever it turns out to be in a political kind of group, recognizing whatever the needs are of the board, perhaps. Especially if 2 members of the board are going to be named financial committee members. With or without a financial kind of background. So I would think that we want to have the voting input of the insiders who know something that the other members may not know or need input. To exclude them seems odd.
I think it's generally the case in my experience. I clearly, you know, there's an independence here from people who are employed by the entity. So this is a, depends on what you want to do. You want to be advisory board or you want to be a board that makes decisions? If you're gonna be advisory board, it might be a different story. I'm just telling you that from my experience, if you're gonna have a committee like this, it's gonna ultimately make the decision. You typically don't have insiders. It's independent. Clearly, the insiders, are said time and again, are critical to the input.
Right.
You know, they make presentations, board meetings that boards have done, make presentations because they know the stuff. They deal with the process. They advise the you know, the committee, the board, help train, if you will, those folks to understand the process. But there's an independence that's being presented by the committee itself, by the members of the committee, with the thinking, okay, this is how we're going to go forward.
So if I'm understanding correctly, what you're suggesting is a choice between the finance committee members being an advisory or they're a decision-making saying to the board, here's our decision. You're gonna have, you better use this or accept it. Or you have no choice in it. This is our decision. We've already told UBS or whoever to make the changes.
That's not the thinking. The thinking is that the board has delegated that authority to the committee. The board, you know, we're not ramping this down the board, you know, throat. The board has given us the power, the authority to make these decisions, right? They're delegating this, you know, through resolution.
To come up with an advice or a, we decide this is the best thing for you to do, you have to say yes or no.
No,
Is that-
we decide as a committee, so one structure,
Right.
we construct as any way we want to structure, right? I mean, this is the structure. The board delegates authority to us to carry out the responsibilities. We make the decisions. We get the input from the employees, right? The staff. They implement, right? We are the ones who make decisions, but they're going to end up implementing a lot of this stuff. Right? So you have people who are making decisions who are separate than the folks who are actually implementing.
But that would be a change to what is
Yes.
done,
Yeah.
how it's done now. I mean, how it was
Yeah,
it's
set up.
okay.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it makes sense to have people who make decisions who are also implement. Depends on what the conflict may be. Could be a conflict.
Kevin, I think you're making very good points. But we may be at a point where there's not unanimous agreement on this finance committee. So then the question would be, how do we make a decision? Like I said, I can only speak for myself in the context of how I understand this committee. I am okay as one voting member with one vote, with Kim and Robin also having a vote. But I think you're making good points, and I think it was worth sort of talking this out. But I don't know how to make a decision. We may not, there's going to be things where we're not going to have a unanimous agreement on everything, and that's, yeah. So
It's good that we have.
Yeah, it's
open
good.
discussions.
It absolutely is. And, you know, maybe
Okay.
Mike Hoffman has something to say about it.
I was
Maybe,
gonna
you know,
suggest that we not finalize it right now, but let me talk to Mike and offer the conundrum or the
yeah, just say here's the-
discussion that
right.
we're dealing with to see, okay, in addition to this question, with what we're trying to redo that we think is gonna be helpful, is there anything else we need to think about? We haven't thought of, that we're trying to put in place.
And you can give them the Zoom link here.
Yeah, that's right.
He charges by the hour, but
It's possible Mike Hoffman comes back and says it's really up to the board, not us, but have the board on how they want the committee to work. And it's really not my vote, it's the board's,
Okay,
I'm okay with that. I just,
okay.
But we're talking about changing this committee and the general manager's responsibilities and relative to finance in pretty major ways.
Can we segue into ex officio from the city?
Sure.
Currently, having to do with membership.
before we leave, I did have a couple of things that I thought were worth talking about on this that had nothing to do with the voting structure.
Which one's that?
But, is someone gonna take a restab at this? Is that the idea?
Yeah.
So I can either bring them up now, or we can, whoever's gonna sort of
Bring
take
it
the
up
first
now.
stab out.
Is this?
So this would be that,
Resolution?
Yeah.
The res-
is that what it's called? Yeah, on section 5. I didn't understand number 1. The Lewes BPW charter to assess issues with accuracy and adequacy. That,
That's not an aspect to me, because this is a finance committee, why would we be doing that? And unless we're talking about, the charter has some elements of the finance committee in it, or something to that effect. I don't
Yes, that's
remember.
what-
Do you remember what the finance committee wording is? Well, that's not, I think, great thoughts here. Can we get a
I don't
copy?
Possible
charter
that the
actually
charter
No.
just says that BPW has to operate with accuracy and adequacy, and we're reading more into it than,
it might be.
Indeed.
I just brought it up for
Yes,
clarity, yeah.
that's fine.
Number 4 is the next one, the previous fiscal year and the most recent month's financial report. If we have adopted the new structure,
Right,
the way that probably would work is that quarterly Kim would come in, we'd have the budget that we approved. And every new quarter, she would come in and say, well, here's how the year's progressing.
That
So it
makes
wouldn't be a
sense.
monthly sort of, maybe be a quarterly. How are we going against budget?
right,
So that would be some changing there.
right.
Number 7, the overall risk management plans and major insurance policy, the Lewis Board of Public Works. I'm not sure
What's that have to do?
what the overall risk management plan is. There probably is some overlap with finance and risk management, but, and we can talk about that, but
Right.
that was a little bit unclear to me. And then I don't know what the rate analysis report is.
Is there a risk management plan? There's a strategic plan, right? Plan, risk
There's a
management plan, synonymous?
strategic
Here?
plan, but there is no risk management.
There's no risk management plan?
No, there's a strategic plan.
Okay.
There's a strategic plan and there's a contingency plan.
It's a what?
Contingency
Oh, yeah.
plan, which is basically a long list of phone numbers, and if this happens, call this guy.
Retreat, call
If
it.
this happens, call that guy. Mobilize this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I've read my section 5 as well, and I didn't understand a lot of this stuff. I still know, do we have a capital reserve policy? By the way, I can't find that one either.
We have a reserve cash policy.
Well, these are things we're going to talk about a little later in this meeting.
So what are you suggesting?
But Calvin, you might, well, no,
Consulting.
I think Richard has opened up. Let's rethink policies, and I think that's great. These 4 things on just section 5 stood out to me. I think we should address the voting structure one way or another, how that's going to work. That should be probably specific in this.
Mhm.
I think Calvin's points about making sure this is integrated in with the other document, that all makes sense. And I think we would all agree with that, and they have to be all copacetic. So I think we're doing the right stuff. I just wanted to point out the thing that's
That's
just
fine.
stuck out to me.
So in the committee, one of the members is official from the city,
Oh, that's me, okay.
and it says ex officio. But it's not clear whether it's the treasurer, whether it's a council person. Whether it's a council person with financial background. I think Mike said, look, you can say an officer or a member that is offered by the city, but you can't define who it really is. The city has to decide who they want to put on this committee.
Yeah, you
Well,
can't
why
do
would
that
they be the
too.
treasurer of or the finance person in the city's? city?
What was your question? Why?
Why wouldn't it be like you were?
Oh, no, I'm
You
not
were on the
disputing
finance
that.
committee.
What he's saying is that,
No, you were the ex officio.
okay, but listen to what I have to say. What I hear you saying is, do we have the right to tell the city specifically what that person is?
Yes,
That's what I hear him saying. And what were you saying?
I agree. That should be like you were on the finance committee. You chaired the
See,
finance
my whole
committee.
background is finance.
Well, that's the point. So that's the point. So the head of the finance committee.
No, my
The
personal
city?
opinion, hell yes, have a person who comes in your committee that has a background. You
Preferably,
can have any
But-
person just come and sit, but if they don't have any background in
But-
what you're doing.
but preferably the chairperson of that finance committee on this committee. Because that chairperson presumably would have some.
Well, you can't make that assumption.
Yeah.
You can't make that
It's a-
assumption with the
They
city.
have a political collection just like we do.
That's right.
So their treasurer might not have a strong finance background or
That's
any
right.
finance background.
Or, and their treasurer might be head of their finance committee, but it still doesn't have a, financial background.
Can their
And that's-
financial manager like Kim be one of those, or does it have to be a board member?
That's the question.
Yeah, okay,
We can't over define.
yeah.
Probably the best we could do is to say, we want the treasurer, but
I think my suggestion would be to do just that, because I think that the chairperson of the finance committee is going to have a Kim behind her. Right?
Yeah.
So if we pose questions that this person can answer, we'll just say, can you go back to?
Well,
Kim?
when I was chair, when I was treasurer, okay, when I got on the committee, automatically asked me to do it, and I said, sure, because that's my strength. And I would bring my financial person with me, because I thought, one, it was good for her to have the experience,
Right.
and good if I had something I needed to bounce off of her, because she's been there for God knows how long.
Right.
Then I found it to be an asset to bring the person, so I
Absolutely.
guess what gets me is, before me, there was Bonnie Olson. And I don't know, Bonnie's background wasn't finance, but she did know it. So it's hard, you never know who the hell's coming on to your committee, and it's hard to say who has the expertise you need to be on the committee, but you can't tell the city who they can and can't have.
I say we try it.
I say you don't. I say
I
let the
say you
city
don't either.
appoint,
The city has a right to
Because
appoint, that's in the,
they might have
that's the city
know,
manager's right.
somebody that knows
I mean,
who's a council person,
city
somebody who doesn't know, but the finance,
That's, you're taking authority away from the mayor,
Um,
just the mayor appoints.
I mean, the reason for doing it in the first place is that you get some information transferring and coordination between
The two.
Robin's gonna dig up the street
yeah,
and somebody else is gonna pay for.
so let me run that by our choice, I think, is to say treasurer of city council
That would be my
as ex
recommendation.
officio.
And let them
Just
decide who
like
that.
ours at the moment, is that I'm ex officio on.
Or appoint an alternate.
Right, exactly.
And you've raised the point that if Amy becomes the mayor, it would be inappropriate for her to be an ex.
I think so.
Oh, absolutely.
But there'd be nothing stopping her from being one if she wanted to be.
I guess not.
She could appoint herself.
Right, and we would have no objection.
No,
Because
I
she
would love
has
that.
the knowledge,
She-
but
she has
I don't know
background
about the bandwidth, and what are the optics of,
There's nothing that says that she couldn't stay on this committee.
well, anyway,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, it was more of a, yeah.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
nothing to say that the mayor, just like,
If she wants to appoint herself as a member ex officio.
So the last
So you probably want to point someone else.
Stephen,
The last issue is the 3 or 4 volunteers. And we should define that they have that first of all, they'd be a resident. And that they have some financial business background. I think,
So the resident one might be a little tricky.
yes, hell yeah.
might be, but we don't want somebody who lives in California and is renting a house here and says, well, I've got a house there.
Yeah, Mike lives in Chelmsford.
Yeah,
We're-
I do.
Well, thank you for everything, Mike.
Meetings will be shorter.
That's not.
But
The reason I say that is less, if we constrain right out of the gate, then you've taken, I think most people, I would imagine if you were vetting a new person and they were from the UK and they were gonna call in and they had no knowledge of, nobody on here is gonna vote for them. But if you sort of pre-constrain it, so take the CFO from Rehoboth that I was floating last year.
Right.
He's not a resident, he's a resident of Rehoboth, not of Lewes, so where does that residency reside? And if you put the Lewes residency constraint on it, that would take him out of the running without even having a discussion about whether that would be a good expertise to bring.
well, the idea of having the residential constraint is somebody with skin in the game that is sensitive to what's going on.
I already been down this
But Mike
road.
has skin in the game. He's got a house in Lewes.
Yes,
But does
But
that
that's
consider
different
me
than
a
a resident.
resident? I can't vote
It's
in
a
a city
rate.
election.
Yeah.
I can't, but I can vote in a PPW
Yes, you
election. I
can.
can't vote in a city election.
Well, you know what?
Bingo.
That's the criteria.
What, that you can vote for BPW? I always, look,
Well,
we
anyway,
can do whatever we want.
that's-
I always try to not constrain myself any more than I absolutely need to get the job
just
done.
leave it vague as a volunteer
You're
member.
looking, volunteer member that has skill in this area, and then it'd be up for the board members at that time to determine whether everything considered, that person should be on here. If you come out of the gate constraining, then
You're limiting your pool
you're limiting your
too.
pool, and
Absolutely.
Okay.
look how hard it's been to try to find people with finance backgrounds.
Remember, that came up before
Okay,
the city council,
never mind.
outside residents.
What came up to city council?
The whole idea of people being out of the city and being on various committees. But I remember when I don't know the committee I was on, we had an architect, they needed an architect and they couldn't find one, so the gentleman that was on that committee lived somewhere out here, but he was not in the city of Lewis. But they had to have an architect, so they took it. I remember when I got on that board, he was on there.
That was H Park, H Park.
Yeah, remember, yeah, you remember, you were there when I first.
No
got there.
problems. I can give you
Right,
my experience.
thank
I joined the finance committee of Winter Museum.
Right.
I didn't live in the state of Delaware. I had no take on it. I considered it a national treasure and I just wanted to help out. And they accepted they accepted my contribution on that group.
But you're 10 miles you live 10 miles from.
That's right, but in different state. But my point is, yeah.
Right.
The Children's Beach House, I live in the same area, but they're not a political entity. They're just serving the state of Delaware. I'm not a resident of,
Okay,
so it's just,
Yeah, you're a perfect
Okay.
example. to use.
Well, I mean, just finish that conversation. No nexus at all to Lewis. Person lives in, where?
no hardwired in. That will be made by the committee as it's
So, I understand, but there's no nexus, they don't have a home here, they don't have any interest in Lewis,
possibly,
okay, but they have the expertise.
they have the expertise. That's the driving.
And so what's their interest in becoming a member of BPW?
They may not have any, so maybe we'll never even see any. I'm just
It's
saying, be
the
careful about
publicity
constraining
you
yourself
get.
before.
Yeah, well, that's the word is.
Don't self-constrain if you
Yeah,
don't need to.
I- I-
That's really my
Yeah,
point.
that
I get that, but-
is, the point, because you limit.
Well, you know,
Yeah,
well,
Yeah, yeah.
either side of the spectrum here, because,
Don't
that's someone
limit
who's
your
just great, but
resources.
they have no
But they live in Dewey, so we can't take them. You know what I mean? Especially him.
Okay,
All right.
moving on. The guidelines. As a preamble, Mike has suggested that he might have some thoughts that would be helpful to us.
Richard,
Okay.
before we jump to that, there was one other thing that we wanted to, talk about. For this upcoming board meeting, we
Yes.
need to know if everybody would like to stay on or,
Oh,
because we have
yes.
to renew
that's right.
So-
Yeah.
That's right.
the seats.
So we comply with the
Mhm.
Yeah,
resolution.
so just simply ask them.
I quit.
Just getting
Let
started.
me tell you something.
As of when-
When I came up to council, Richard had come to me and asked me, and I said, when I came up to council, I
So
wasn't
you're
joining anything.
asking Carolyn and me, we're the only two, and Calvin as a three.
Yeah.
Is it your intention to stay on the committee?
If that's to serve, I would like to
Yes.
stay on.
Look how long.
For
I
one
know,
more
I
year.
know, it's-
Well, I think that's right. Ask to serve. then
Yes.
and we'll-
I wouldn't be here if I didn't think
Okay.
I was contributing, so you know.
Thank you, Sharon.
Yep.
Keeping us on track.
So are we asked to serve?
So what we will do is we will submit a recommendation to the board that we would like you guys to stay on, and then they have to approve it.
There you
Yeah.
go.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's a year.
Yes.
Yeah, I like endings.
Something to look forward to.
Oh, we don't have staggered, we're all kind of on the same cycle. so-
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
right now it
That's
says
extreme.
March
By definition right
31st
now.
of the year.
Yeah.
So,
Ah, there you go.
Let's not complicate things.
Yeah.
You know, there's the reason why you have staggered boards. You don't want them all leaving at the same time.
Well.
That's just a big.
Mhm.
Okay. Mike?
Sure. So I thought, if it's
By the way,
okay,
we're talking about this thing.
okay with everybody, yeah, I wanted to maybe talk a little bit more generally about investing and pools of capital, use of advisors and things like that, maybe to kind of sort of level set with the conversation, but the Board of Public Works, like almost any organization, maintains funds that are designed or missioned to solve certain financial obligations and issues. There's a lot of funds around. Some of those funds tend to be formal funds. They may have governance documents. They may even be regulated with broader authority than even the organization itself, like a pension fund. Or they may be very informal, like a vacation fund, your fund that you're putting together to go to Italy or something like
Yeah, no,
that,
we
which
have
doesn't
those.
have anything. Yeah. So the funds that the Board of Public Works maintains are what is being addressed by this document here. So I want to talk a little bit more about the nature of funds. First off, a fund is a set of assets that have been put aside for a specific purpose. That sounds pretty generic. But there's an amazing number of funds that are out in the markets. There's pension funds, which are designed to pay defined benefit pension plans. There's a mutual fund, equity mutual fund, which is designed to invest people's assets in the equity market. There are rainy day funds. There are reserve funds. There are
Bond funds.
bond funds. There's ETFs, exchange traded funds. I mean, it goes on and on and on. They are simply a structure to try to solve some kind of issue. I said many funds are formal, and they have regulatory documents and policy documents, and some of them are very informal. So as we go through the funds of this organization here, we have to think which ones are formal and which ones are a little bit looser, and what the policy documents might look like. In many cases, a fund is a preferred way of solving a financial problem, but it's not the only way. So for example, if you had a rainy day fund for an emergency, if you have that emergency, you have those funds available, but you could also have a line of credit to do that.
Mhm.
If you wanted to invest in a capital project 5 years from now, you could start raising a fund today to fund that capital project in 5 years, or you could take a loan in 5 years and pay for that project. You could raise debt in the market You could get an insurance policy. You could buy derivatives, options, futures, things like that. There's a lot of different ways oftentimes to solve a particular financial problem. Fund is not the only way, but it is an important way, and it's a way that a lot of organizations choose to solve these problems. In the case of the Board of Public Works, the use of a fund has some allocation effects to it. So for example, if you've got a pipe in the ground, I'm going to make this really simple, Robin. I know I'm going to be way off on this, but over the course of 10 years, that pipe is being worn out. It's depreciating. If you decide to fund the new pipe that's going to replace the depreciated pipe by building a fund along the way, what you're doing is you're charging the people that are wearing the pipe out the cost of that new replacement fund. In other words, you're charging it for the depreciation. If instead you decide, well, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to take a loan out at the end of the 10-year period when I put the new pipe in, what you're going to do is charge the people in the future for the worn out pipe because now they have to pay for the debt service. So there's an allocation issue too about whether you raise a fund to solve a problem in some cases, or whether you take a line of credit or a loan or a debt issuance or something like that. So there are things to think about in the nature of funds. The important point I wanted to say was a fund isn't the only way in many cases to solve a particular problem. Like a rainy day fund can also be solved with a line of credit. The goals of the fund play a big role in how the fund's assets are actually invested. So Bob mentioned a bond mutual fund. A bond mutual fund's goal is to invest the assets of the mutual fund holders in bonds. So their assets are all invested in bonds. A rainy day fund, an emergency fund, or let's say a vacation fund may be invested in a bank account. So its assets are demand deposits. They're deposits at a bank account. A company that is maintaining an emergency fund may invest, that needs to be very liquid, may invest those in a money market fund. They want to know what the fixed NAV, they want to know the size of it, and they want to be able to get access to it
Yeah.
in one day. There's no screwing around.
The main thing is access to.
Access to it. You could have an insurance policy for the rainy day fund, but a lot of times you can't get access to that money in one day.
Right.
So you got to go through a whole process. So the important point here is that the mission or the goal of the fund, what its purpose is, will go a long way to dictate how its assets are invested, whether they're invested in the equity markets or the bond markets or a bank account. An endowment, the Children's Beach House has a very large endowment. That endowment is vested in global stocks, global bonds, and global money market instruments. Winither had even a much larger endowment. That endowment was invested in global stocks, global bonds, and cash, but it was also invested in private equity instruments and hedge funds. And, so these things, depending on what the mission or the goal of these funds is, will play a big role in how their assets are invested.
So you're pretty much matching you're doing matching the maturity matching with the obligation.
Not in those cases, but that is a viable alternative, and I want to talk about that in a minute. So, but it's a great point. The idea of a maturity in something like an equity is a very loose concept. It's very crisp and clear in a bond. A 5-year bond has a 5-year maturity. An investment in IBM, it's not really clear what the maturity, of the IBM investment is, but your concept is important, and I want to talk about that. The last thing I want to talk about is, along these kind of general setting themes, is that in a properly functioning financial market, the return you would expect to get on an asset, whether it be a bond, a stock, private equity investment, so on and so forth, will be very closely related to the risk that you have to accept to take that, to get the expectation of that return. And I'm going to use this word expectation, just like everything that we talked about a month ago with our new financial architecture. It's all about the future. When you're talking about the future, it's all about expectation. It's not, the only thing we have in certain is what happened in the past. We have no idea what's going to happen in the future. So now we're using this word expectation. But suppose that you were going to go get a loan, a HELOC loan, let's say, or a car loan, and you go to a bank, they're going to ask you to make your credit scoring available to them so they could judge whether you're a good credit or not, or what level of credit you are. So you're going to have to open up Equifax and TransUnion and Experian so they can get access to your credit scores. The lower your credit score, the higher the interest rate you're going to pay on that loan.
That's right.
From the bank's perspective, they are requiring a higher rate of return to meet the risk that you pose to them when they lend you that money. If you're a corporation and you want to go into the bond market and raise money by issuing a bond, you have to go get your bond rated. Now, they don't use TransUnion and Equifax. They actually use Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Fitch, but it's the same sort of concept. And so Standard & Poor's will give a bond a AAA rating, a AA rating, a single, it's a scoring of the credit quality of that bond. The lower the credit quality, the higher the interest rate that company will have to pay in the market to get access to that capital. So there's this relationship between risk and return. If you have a bad driving history, this is another one. Or you happen to have a home that's located right on the coast, like mine, you have a lot more risk than somebody with a really good driving history and has a home located in Chatsworth, Pennsylvania, which doesn't have access to, doesn't have the hurricane issues. So I pay a lot more for insurance down here when I sell my risk to the insurance company than I do, back in Pennsylvania. And in fact, if you really think about what the financial system is, a lot of people don't think about it this way. Actually a giant risk manager. That really is what finance in an important essence is all about. You're trading in equity, the company is selling the risk to its cash flow stream. In a bond, a company is selling risk into the market. So if you think about finance as a risk manager, it starts to kind of make that connection between return and risk in assets. Now, where does this all take us? So, the Board of Public Works, Kim, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but has basically three large buckets of funds that are pertinent for this discussion. We have cash funds, and they're, you go to your statement of objectives and guidelines for investments. The page 2, under number 1, there's something called collection and disbursement accounts, and there's something called cash and liquidity accounts. Okay, I'm going to lump those two in, and I'm going to call them. There's some wordsmithing in here, but I'm just going to call those two, a cash fund.
Yeah.
Possibly with slightly different. Now, if you have a cash fund yourself, where do you put your cash funds? Where do you put your vacation fund and your sort of living expenses and, things like that?
I can tell you where I put mine.
Well, where do you put it?
Well, right now, because I locked in for vacation, I put it in treasury so that I get
Very safe, very liquid.
and I can turn it around in time when I'm ready to go on vacation.
Yep. I would imagine a lot of people put it in a bank account, or they,
Well, there's no money there. Well, yes,
Yeah.
logically you put it in a bank account, but
or you put it in a, let's say, a money market, like you
there's
did.
everything to do with how fast you want to turn it over.
Right. Now, the important thing, or another important piece of this is that if these funds require high degree of liquidity and a high degree of certainty of value, you really only have a couple of real choices. It's the money market savings account or a checking account. That means that you're investing in a very low risk way. If you keep your bank account under $250,000, it's FDIC insured. So you're going to get your money even if the bank goes under.
Right.
Or there's a run on the bank. And if you put it in a government money market fund, there are other money market funds, but if you put it in a government money market fund, you put $100 in, you're going to get $100 out. So the purpose of these is dictating how they're invested. Now, we also have a series of reserve funds. We have an operating reserve fund, and Kim, I'm not exactly sure, we can wordsmith this later, what a reserve cash fund is, but leaving that aside for a moment, we have an operating reserve fund and we have a capital reserve fund. In fact, it's a little bit more complicated than that. The formula actually has in a sense, operating reserves for each one of the four utilities. They get added up to the total operating reserves. And it has capital reserves for each utility that get added up to the total capital reserves. You may remember that when we did our financial structure, that's all laid out, how those numbers are arrived and what proportions they are to each one of the utilities, but that's neither here nor there. If you think about what an operating reserve is, an operating reserve, the way it's policy now at the Board of Public Works, it's largely an emergency fund and a way to help potentially smooth cash flow mismatches within the year. So it's one of these highly liquid, we got to have access
Yeah,
to it.
movable. Mhm.
Now, it's going to be a couple of $1 million, so you can't stick it in a bank account where you're now on, most of it's uninsured. So at minimum, if you need a high degree of liquidity and you have to understand what your value is, you're over the $250,000 limit in a bank account, you're probably going to stick it in a money market fund. But my point is that the purpose of that operating reserve will dictate how its assets are invested. The capital reserve, which is dictated more to fund future capital projects,
Right.
that's a different animal.
Mhm.
And to Calvin's point, there's a lot of interesting ways that could be invested. One way is you could still take all those assets and put it in a bank, but it'll be too big for the $250,000 limit. So we'll put them in, so you could put it in money markets
Somewhere we
and
grow.
be liquid and safe.
Right.
But you could also do what Calvin suggested and said, you know what? I know I have a project 8 years out. What if I invested, if that project was $1 million 8 years from now, and I knew what my interest rate is on a bond, I could invest $800,000 now in the bond, and it would mature in those 8 years at $1 million, and then I'll have cash for that project. So generically, that's called a cash matching strategy or a asset liability matching strategy. It's a common way, especially in the defined benefit pension area. The younger people won't know what a defined benefit pension plan is, but back in the day, companies used to issue these benefit.
To your
Yes.
demise.
Maybe you do, I don't know. Most of my career has been more in 401k plans, but
I don't have it, but
Okay.
previous employees here have it.
Have
They're
it?
still
Okay.
paying.
I love those
Okay.
monthly checks.
But the board has $2 million of the cash is pension.
so it is
Or
not.
$2 million of the reserves is pension. Sorry.
It's separate. It's got its
Yeah,
own
it's separate.
account. Yeah.
So it's not uncommon for somebody a company that has a large defined benefit plan to cash match that. In other words, they have actuaries that'll say, next year you're going to owe this much, the year after you're going to owe that much, the year after that, you're going to owe that much. And they will actually go out and buy a series of laddered bonds, or they're called strips in the market, and they will look to match
Is that
those
what you
cash
do?
flows.
That's when we had that meeting with Tim, that's
Yeah.
what he was hinting at, of having a ladder. For-
But at times you can be underfunded too, where you have to
Yes.
Yeah, that's where it's.
make a
yeah.
contribution,
That's right.
and that could be,
Which,
depends on.
I think apparently we're
Balance.
underfunded by about 20%, 25%.
I can't remember the number, but we are underfunded.
So in Winterthur, just to use them as an example, and I actually should be careful with public, but when I was on there, they were managing, as many companies do, their defined benefit plan as a general pool of assets. And it was slightly underfunded, as many companies are. We fully funded it, and then we cash matched it. So we changed the strategy. By cash matching it, what you're doing is taking almost all the risk away. So if you think about the way it defined, I don't want to go too far down but I want to make a point on this risk versus in a pension plan, the benefits are discounted to present values using current interest rates in the market. And as interest rates change, the value of those future obligations can change a lot. So many companies find that have big defined benefit plans, a lot of variability, a lot of risk that they have no control over. It's not an operating risk. It's interest rate risk in the market. So the way you fix that is you either shut down your defined benefit plan, or you shut it down, but you cash match the outstanding obligations, and you get rid of that risk. So it's not a risk that you need to manage anymore. But it does require, to Calvin's point, that that pension plan be brought up to to be made whole before you cash match it. That's a different piece. Where I'm sort of heading with this is, you can make a very strong case that the cash accounts should be in bank accounts and money markets. We don't need an advisor for them, and I assume that those assets are not given to UBS, so we're not paying an advisory fee.
We do have a money market with UBS, but there is no advisory fee.
Okay.
That's good.
Question is, what do you do with the operating reserves and the capital reserves, the two other pools? I think a strong case could be made that the operating reserves should also be invested in a money market. Should be highly liquid, it's an emergency fund, it's to smooth intra-year cash flows. If it's in a money market, that also should not be subjected to an advisory fee. In other words, you don't need an advisor
No.
to talk about the money market.
Mhm.
So that would be taken away from UBS, or at least the advisory part of UBS. And then the question is, what do you do with the capital reserve
Well,
account?
just for a second. So do they not charge us in one case because they have the money and for the money market? I mean, are they balancing it out and looking at the entire? So if we say on the operating reserves, we don't put that money market and we don't want to be pay a fee, will they then reassess the whole fee structure then? And they say,
No,
wait a minute, we
They keep it separate, the two accounts are separate, that when they do the charge, 80 basis points, it's based on the average of that year for the reserve account only,
so
is what they
80
charge.
basis points for the operating reserve?
on the
The money
reserve.
account?
No, not the money
Mm-mm.
market, just the reserve.
So separating the
Yeah,
cash account from the,
okay. I know where you're going, but I'm just.
yeah. There is times where you may want to pay an advisory fee,
Yeah.
but there's times where you don't want to pay an advisory
This is
fee.
one where you don't want to pay it.
And if we decide as a committee here in a recommendation that the operating reserve should simply be invested in a money market fund,
Mhm.
a government-based money market fund for liquidity purposes and all that, that does not need an advisory oversight.
That's right.
So we take them out. Now, the negative is, if you take those assets away from UBS is probably already complaining that the assets are already low,
And they're gonna.
and now you just cut them in half again.
Mhm.
So then the question is, what does that do with your capital reserves? In other words, at some point, if you have $3 million in capital reserves, they may say, it's not really worth
It's
our
not enough
time to
money,
be.
right?
Exactly.
So that may force you into doing money market with that as well. That may not be a bad thing.
That's right.
It is the alternative to doing the cash matching strategy. I don't have a strong view here one way or another. I would say that if we do go to a formal cash matching strategy, I think that we're going to have an advisor.
Amen.
But if we keep all the reserves in money markets, I think you jettison your advisor altogether.
How much were you paying the advisory fees?
$56,610
A year.
in the past year.
So, I mean,
All right, that's,
and that's on roughly $8 million.
56,000 on 8 million.
And for that, we get whatever they do and 4 conversations a year.
Or whatever you want, those 4 conversations, because that's what you dictate.
Well, we could get 12 conversations, but I'm not sure we or they would be any smarter.
But see, that's the
Huh?
issue. That's exactly the issue.
I mean, Richard had a meeting with them last week. I came, Robin. And what I kind of learned is we're too small for them. It's $56,000 is, would have bought the first 5 houses I lived in, but and you could have owned them all at the same time. But in today's world, that's half of one, start out employee. You're not gonna get a lot of high-level management. You might be part of a bigger pool that gets managed aggressively, but
Well,
So-
the bottom
so-
line is that you're small.
collectively, what we're talking about, the investment account, collectively. What's the size? 5, 6. Like the
What do you mean? The dollar amount?
dollar amount.
For reserve, we have about 8 million, and for the money market, we're about 2 million now.
10 million.
But you know, you could walk down Bay Avenue, knock on doors and find $10 million to invest. With, somebody might answer the door and if you were,
Well, you can if you'd like.
huh?
I think what you're hearing from UBS is that the amount of money that the Board of Public Works has for advisory relationship is small enough that it falls into a higher net worth wealth advisor as opposed to an institutional advisor. They would rather be in the 50 million, 100 million, 200 million,
Yeah,
300 million,
Exactly,
you know,
exactly.
not the 8 million or 10 million. I know that's big money for individuals, but at an institutional level, that's not big money.
And then big company.
I think we're just, you know, a client that
An afterthought.
been around for a long time, but we're not
That's exactly it.
getting their best efforts, nor they,
Yeah, I mean,
frankly, do we deserve it.
what are they throwing it in anyway? Money market mutual funds anyway?
I am not sure what the,
Well,
They
yeah,
Carol
yeah,
was
yeah,
big
yeah.
on the presentation the other day, but
I mean, what are you suggesting that we can save that 56,000 by having this committee think about?
well, I'm sort of
Well-
going in stages here. First thing I'm suggesting is that we're rethinking the investment policy.
Yeah.
So the question is here, if this group believes that the investment policy should reasonably be money market mutual funds for these reserves, you've made your decision on your advisor. You know, there's no,
That's
I mean,
absolutely right.
if you decide that you want to have global equities and bonds and blah, 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 all that stuff, then you're going to need an advisor for that stuff.
and I don't think we're big enough to play in global equities and alternatives and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. I think this small number, I mean,
Nor do I believe they would really meet the goals of this. What you'd have is a lot of swings and values over
Yeah.
time. You're trying, you know, your luck is that when you need that $1 million, it's now 800,000 because the market took a big tank and,
Yeah.
you know, and
Yeah.
you're, you know, so the real question is, you could, by the way, do equities and bonds and all that. You could do them through index funds, but
Yeah,
I don't think it's the appropriate investment vehicle for these types of.
we're not.
Phil, I mean, the portfolio is fairly small, right? 10 million. I- my thinking is that we want to be very conservative because if we have too much volatility, I mean, it's going to really impact. You know,
You can't plan, it's
Yeah.
hard, you
you
know.
know, I mean, I steady as they go, right? I mean, strong with money market mutual funds or mutual funds that give you,
Well, still gonna need
you
somebody
know,
to do
3,
it.
4, 5, 6% return, whatever the returns are now, consistently, month after month, year after year. You don't, can sleep better, right? I mean, the portfolio is fairly small. I mean, if you have a $20 million portfolio, you can take some chances there. I mean, you have some room to, you know, to maneuver. You have a long term.
See,
You know,
but
I could wait 30 years.
I don't want
you
to
know,
cut you off, but I want to make a
20
point on this because you're going, the size of the portfolio doesn't matter. It's the size of the portfolio relative to the liability that is
years.
funded.
Yes.
If you've got $100 million
That's a good
liability and
point.
$80 million portfolio, you do
agree.
not have room to mess around.
I was,
That's right.
no, I was, yeah, probably $20 million and I wouldn't care. Right?
Yeah.
Because my expenses are
That's right.
more.
That's a whole,
Yeah,
your liability is tiny compared to your
Exactly,
asset pool.
exactly. But BPW is different, completely different.
Yeah, in fact, we legally, at the end of the day, you can't be building giant, let me go to the extreme. Let's say in the next 10 years, you got $5 million in capital projects and you build a capital reserve of $100 million. You're gonna have irate
Yeah.
users here saying, what the hell you think you're doing, you know? So they're gonna be in
Absolutely.
alignment by their nature.
Until the nor'easter wipes out half the city, and then they're gonna say, boy, was that good.
Our bias is, you know, been on this board almost a year. You know, the pipe under the
No,
canal breaks. Now, fortunately, that was an identified project, or the solution was an identified project. There were applications, grants, and so on already applied for. Had those grants not been applied for, had that money not, we would have had to come up with $2 million, 1.85 or something, on our own in a short period of time to finish that project. And I'm pretty confident the board would have spent the money to do that. You know, hopefully we get to rebuild those reserves and so on, but in a $10 million portfolio, $2 million that hits you overnight is a big deal.
It's an emergency.
It's an emergency, but it has to be, you know, it doesn't have to be today, but it has to be 45 days, 6 months available.
All right, so where are you headed here?
Well, so there was a couple other things, but the first thing was to understand that these things have different goals. The goals will determine what the asset allocation is. I think you could reasonably make the case that both the operating reserves and the capital reserves could be money market invested. If they are money market invested, you don't need to be paying for an advisor. And I just want to make sure everybody's comfortable with that. I didn't want to just say, go get rid of your advisor. I have no issues with
No, but you gotta have
UBS.
somebody
There's
in mind.
role, there might be a role for UBS in certain situations. You guys just aren't. They're not earning enough money to give you much attention, and you're not getting enough
Getting
out of
enough out of
them.
it, right.
You're not going to get anything out of them if it's in a money market. So,
But is there alternative, and when do we consider those alternatives?
okay, so the alternative, the big alternative is going to be in the capital reserves. If this group decides they want to cash match those future liabilities.
Which is one option.
Which is one option, but so is a money market. That's a very specific option as well. So,
But if you cast match, would you take higher risk?
not necessarily. The risk you would have is whether you misidentified the cost of that project today. So for example, let's say you thought 10 years from now, the value at that time was going to be $1 million, and today you set aside 800,000, you put it in a bond, and it matures to $1 million.
And then it comes
But you made a
out to be-
boo-boo, and it was really
Yeah.
$1.5 million.
Yeah.
But that's not a financial risk. That was something totally separate from a planning perspective, though.
Well, it is, yeah.
It's,
But
it's operate well, you know, it's a strategic, whatever the risk is,
It's a
but
plan.
it's not a financial risk.
It is a financial risk. It's your liability is unknown. That's your liability. And so you have to understand, and this is a lot of issues that pension plans have. When your liability is unknown, if you take on a risk it's part of that risk profile.
Right. I guess what I would clarify that by saying we went in knowing full well from a financial perspective what we wanted at the end of that rainbow.
Yes.
And so
If you're asking me if we could hit a liability 5 years from now, the answer is yes. You could put it in a treasury inflation protected security that will mature at the, but if you're asking me if there's no risk there, I could say there's still a lot of risk there.
yeah, it's more a planning risk than
Well,
we made the wrong investment though.
but I don't, at the size of your capital reserve now, I don't know that we should even be playing around with things like cash matching and stuff. It's, by the way, there is a mention of cash matching in this document, in the original document.
What's our capital? Is that $8 million? $8 million?
For our full reserve, it's 8 million. Capital,
Is about half that,
yeah, I think it's about half and half of operating and
yeah.
capital.
The risk that you have in a money market is there can be long stretches of time where money markets won't keep up with the rate of inflation. So we just went through a whole episode, years, where we basically had, you were earning 0% on a money market and inflation was a couple of percent a year. So you were actually losing real purchasing power, holding those in money markets.
Sure.
But there are times like now where that's not the case. Now the money markets have a higher return than inflation. So that's another risk that's out there. But anyway,
Once again, we'll widen that gap down the road.
yeah.
The net market.
Well, but some of the alternative investments that a conservative BPW would invest in, bonds and so on, weren't doing well during that period either. Now, alternative investments were doing great in some cases. But we wouldn't have been there.
Yeah. Well, the problem with finance is we used to call it the monkeys on a typewriter problem. If you put enough monkeys on typewriters, one of them is eventually going to type the Iliad. There are so many products, so many strategies, so many money managers, so many funds out there in any given time. In retrospect, there will be a whole group of them that are going to do phenomenally well. The question is, everything about finance and investments is about the future, not about the past. And you don't know what those new ones are going to be in the future.
I once went to a econometric forecast thing, and the smartest thing one of the guys said was, if you forecast and you're an economist, forecast often.
Yeah.
Because,
Information keeps changing and evolving.
and you'll be right sometimes.
Yeah.
And what's the cost of getting out of one investment and getting into another then?
You're talking about unwinding UBS and
Well,
getting
just
into
generally speaking down the road, I mean, if we think about.
money markets are really cheap. I mean, it's almost
I'm
transactional.
not talking about money markets, I'm thinking, if we're thinking about, at times when maybe rates are low.
Go to a cash matching strategy.
Yeah, and then, I mean, I'm just thinking about changing the investment.
Then you're probably going to go back to paying this 80 base. If someone will accept the business at the
That's
size
the
level
point.
you are, you may end up paying another 80 basis point. It'll be based on the assets under management. They'll charge a fee based on the size of your assets. A lot of wealth advisors charge 1% if you go into, of your assets. Your assets go up, they get more. Your assets go down, they get less.
Vanguard's 0.3 in some cases.
Vanguard, you got a lot of money in Vanguard. That's, they're a great option if you don't need, advisory service and you just want cheap access to markets.
You don't have to monitor.
Others are 0.7, but
All right, so, yeah,
Okay, so anyway, I guess I don't know if this is a voting thing. The choice here is, or do you guys want to percolate on this, or are we okay with the operating and the capital reserves being invested in money markets? If that's the case, that will also go one step farther and also have something to say about whether UBS is still
UBS
a
is still
relationship.
enough.
I think Mike, frankly, I'm comfortable, but we ought to use some numbers. Like money markets are paying this, and
I agree, I think we do. Give us some analysis here and. what we talked about before we
and
make a decision.
UBS for the last year has been this. Money markets by comparison in that period of time are whatever.
When you jump to an important but next point, making the decision on whether to go into money markets doesn't tell you whose money market you should be in. And that's another, so I would say, look at UBS's, look at Vanguard, look at your banks. Your bank will have a mutual fund as well. Typically, banks pay a lot lower rate on their money markets than like a Vanguard would or a BlackRock would. But you can gather those rates up.
Yeah, I just think we need a presentation and something to look at and.
Is what you have hypothesized. Is that consistent with the existing investment policy options?
So if I take
So
you
that
to
we
the
don't
last
have to
page,
go through
Take it to the last.
detailed restructuring, wordsmithing the investment policy. We already have that ability, however muddled the policy is.
so page 6 at the very bottom lists a range. Now you'll notice already very quickly that it's inconsistent because you can't do 100% in cash and meet the minimums in the other
Yeah.
the other thing. So this could be reworked. However, to Richard's point, going 100% in the money, if we got rid of that inconsistency, the minimums. In other words, this is telling you, you always have to have at least 15% in equities and you always have to have at least 30% in bonds.
Fixed, yeah.
But that's inconsistent with being able to put 100% in cash. What we're suggesting here is we put 100% in cash instruments. We're going to have zeros in those minimums as an allowable range.
So that would seem to be, we need to change the policy to do this leap or think about making a recommendation to go that way.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It'd be better to have the policy, you know, somewhere in the policy, it's where it says, yeah, here's where you can do it. Or to shoehorn in an interim amendment. That gets that approved and one from there with detailing further as may be appropriate, the investment policy.
Yeah, I guess my recommendation would be to wait for the staff to come back with the presentation on, and then contemporaneously review this, because this thing needs to get revised.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, I don't know how some of these things are even determined.
Yeah, but why not just say, okay. For now, we do this short-term amendment. To allow us to pursue. The beginning shifting of. Assets,
Yeah.
and then we'll look at, you know, is it really worth going
Or page 6.
page by page? Trying to reword, or whether this is a really complete or a major review.
Yeah, I guess my concern would be there's. Without looking at it in total, it could be a contradiction. You're just changing the allocation mix here, but there's something else within the body of the rest of this could be contradictory to what we end up doing anyway. In fact, I know there will be. So you're gonna have to change sections of this anyway.
Oh, yes, but not necessarily,
Saying that.
in the same, you know, in the same short-term timeframe.
I think maybe to Richard's point, at least my first read of this was if you adjust that table.
Yeah,
Bob, the question at hand was Richard asked, looking at that table at the bottom there, could moving to 100%, money market instruments work within this? And it can't, it can in the sense that you're allowed to go to 100% in cash and cash equivalents, but it can't in the sense that there's minimums maintained on all those other assets.
Right.
So this says you should always maintain 15% in equity and you should maintain a minimum of 30% in bonds.
Yeah.
So we would have to make an adjustment to the minimum rate to allow this to happen. But I think that to Calvin's point, there's a whole lot of other things in here to be adjusted. I just don't think they're in conflict to this particular point.
Then I think we just make sure that with that proposed change, we read through this to make sure that there is no conflict. And if there is, making those changes as well.
Right.
But this does need to be right, because the general manager has all the power when it comes to this.
Sorry, Robin, I think Robin is feeling relief.
Yeah, I would be. And it talks about the investment committee. I still don't know what the investment committee is.
And it's non-voting relief.
I think we'll put Robin and Kim on the investment committee.
I mean, I have a whole list of things that can be adjusted here, so I can hand it, rather than read them off to this group, whoever's gonna sort of jump in here.
But I think how do you want, that's fine.
How do we move
I'm
with
okay
this?
that. But this needs a wholesale revision. I mean, how do you want to proceed with that?
Right. What do you suggest? But what's most efficient?
You know?
That doesn't slow down.
No, I think we could we'll do that, but get a couple people together to draft something, redraft this whole thing. We don't need all of
How
it.
about Mike's list and your list? Trying to make sense of it.
Does the lawyer rewrite this?
Mhm.
Does
Does,
Kim rewrite it? Does Sharon rewrite it? Who?
Usually everybody submits comments, I put it all together, then once everything's there, then we have to submit it to Mike, our lawyer, and then he takes the final stab at it.
I'm suggesting maybe one of, someone here, meet with Kim and hash through this thing.
I'm happy to submit all my changes, all my suggested changes, and I'm also happy to review docs or talk to Mike if that would be helpful. I don't want to actually rewrite it myself.
Yeah, the other thing about Mike is, while I think he's a first-class lawyer, I'm not sure he's a first-class finance lawyer.
Yeah.
No.
It's not take.
I don't know if he isn't.
He's got somebody, I think.
Yeah,
This
then
firm
we're gonna
is-
ask somebody.
I mean, yeah, I think that's at least if you were somebody on the phone. In this firm that'll back that up.
Yeah, I think it's where he's at now is
He just needs to have a document. every
He's
fall.
done that before.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I'm happy to sit down with you, Ken,
Okay.
and, if anyone wants to submit comments, and we'll join Ken and myself to just hash through this and put a draft together and throw it out. Yeah, you know, and then, you know, it's a draft,
Yes.
but it would look like this.
Yeah. Well, Calvin, to your point too, this should be more linked into the other, you know, the partly into the earlier document that we reviewed on the purpose of this group and,
Mhm.
you know, it looks like we don't formally have an investment committee. We just have a finance committee, which deals
Right.
with investment and finance related matters, which is perfectly fine.
Maybe we'll put more structure and then
So that too could be sent to Sharon. Comments. To, kind of coordinate or overlap.
Sharon was gonna check with Mike about the idea of Kim and Robin having a vote on the finance committee, whether there's any legal reason. I'll not, I'll do it, okay.
Kim has enough to do.
what I'm proposing is that send any comments you have to Sharon, and Kim and I will sit down and we'll pass through. Once you know the comments, let's pick a date. When by, comments should be due by end of the week.
Is a week enough? Read the comments?
It'll already be mine now.
Okay.
Right, comments by end of the week.
Yep.
And then, Kim and I, and whoever else wants to join us, we'll sit down and we'll look at all the comments and we'll put together a redraft of this with questions. And comment ourselves. Send it back out to everyone and then we'll from there. We'll go around to
Thank you.
Sure, I didn't put my name on it, it's just
That's
in
okay.
case you want to reference back to who they came from. Well, now, what are you gonna do with your extra $50,000 a year?
Raises.
Raises, board, new board compensation. Giving Robin one vote on that.
Yeah, we
I'm
could
sure
triple
he's done it
that.
Calvin, between the 27th and the 4th. For us, all sit together. Would work.
some, yeah, that'd be, 27th and 4th.
Yeah.
Probably be like a long session. Well, we need the comments back.
Right.
first, and then we'll-
That should be on the 21st.
And then you said 27th, but it was
This was
April.
my thing that I.
I know, and I think we were cleaning stuff the other day. You
Oh,
were.
okay, yeah.
And there's a lot of other things in here, like it says for money market,
Let me see if I.
you gotta use the Delaware local government investment pool.
Maybe I have to-
So there is one, I looked it up, but
But I
I wouldn't recommend it myself.
Show it.
So I don't know if these were written,
That's all I
like these are
have.
real legal restrictions on a governmental entity, or if somebody just thought these
One
all sounded good. and-
Yeah, I can look that up. If it's
Let
like
me-
restrictions and you,
Okay.
UBS has
Do you
this copy.
need, you don't need the cover.
So-
page. You
No.
need-
In theory, they should be following
Yeah,
that.
What are the origins of this? Who actually drafted this originally and
the rest.
or any kind of?
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
No, no, no.
Yeah, that was the thing, it was like from back then, when was.
Let's see if I got
This is-
2019.
two.
Well, that was the
yeah, this is
revision.
page number
Yeah,
one.
was it actually drafted
I
though?
made
Yeah.
notes on this.
And I do believe our rate
Okay.
setting consultants did assist with this.
that explains a lot. Hard to understand. Don't put that in our words, no.
Yeah.
That's okay, it's already recorded.
Yeah.
Well, it's public and everyone's gonna listen.
Might Go get Sharon some chocolates or something.
Double sided, which I hate to see.
Yeah, me too.
I can't imagine, Mike reviewed this at all.
I think that he probably glanced at it, but it probably wasn't at the top of the list.
I'm not even sure these pools make sense as they're listed, you know.
good for full
No,
rebate.
and we have a pension, we have day-to-day money, and we have,
Pension's not mentioned in here.
Yeah, this is,
Oh, for.
we do have a pension, but I don't know if that should be included in here because it is an investment, it's just that it's a liability.
One of the things
well, it ought
too,
to be mentioned, I mean, in the finance committees and the board's overall obligations, there's a pension to future employees.
Who oversees that? Who's the manager?
It's nationwide through UBS. UBS comes in and reviews it, but it's nationwide, it actually. That's it.
And it's roughly $2 million, and it's roughly 75%.
And Nationwide was the only person that said that they would
It's so
take
small.
care of it.
Because it's small, yeah.
Well, that should, I think Bob's right. That should be,
There's gonna be a line.
probably be something that, well, you know,
pension,
Well, and then what the UBS guy said the other day was, well, you could fund it up and make it a individual thing so that you turn out an annuity for Robin and an annuity for Kim and an annuity for Sharon. And that was a little beyond what I wanted to think about, but pension is an obligation we have to deal with.
yeah, absolutely.
is it active today, the pension?
Not for new employees, but for some employees that still work here,
How
to
many?
the pension. I don't know the number. And then past employees that have retired.
It's not
Would-
many.
Does it make
Yeah.
sense, is it feasible just to do a payout, cash payout for those folks?
That was an option that we talked about of, funding up to the requirement and then handing it over to the employees that were no longer part of the risk, that it's
Right.
their
Right.
portfolio.
Well, maybe on a,
How many employees do you have?
Right now, we have 21.
21.
Okay,
And how many are covered by the pension?
yeah, so.
I wanna say it's
Active
teens.
Active employees.
Oh, active employees, it
It's
would be
two.
Chris,
And Laura.
Laura,
Thanks.
I think Rhett maybe.
some numbers around that would help.
Yeah, people that have been here for a very long time.
But you have retired people
Correct.
are collecting.
One of the things we talked about is the accounting firm doing a presentation, because this is supposed to go to the board, right? It's the budget, I'm sorry, this is the financial statement, excuse me. This is last year's financial statements.
Yeah, it goes to the board every year, at the audit. Right? That's what that is, right?
Yeah,
What-
thank you.
What is? Oh, okay, yeah,
What
the
do you
audit,
have?
yes,
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
I
yes.
mean, could they make a presentation to us before they go to the board?
yes, that is the
Procedure.
idea,
Okay,
is that finance committee is going to get first presentation and
what is that
And-
schedule? Because this is due like end of the month, isn't it?
no,
End of.
our year end doesn't end until the 31st, so that won't start until the end of April.
Okay, but this is on the plan to make sure that the firm comes and makes a presentation before the board. They make quarterly, they do something quarterly at all, this is just annual?
Yep.
For them.
Who's your auditors?
DNA, Zolonovsky and Axelrod. We call them DNA.
Why?
Yeah.
And do we like them or do we,
Yes, I very much like them.
so they help you throughout the year as well?
Mhm.
Okay. They charge for the consulting fees for that,
They charge a yearly fee.
is that retainer?
It's $35,000 for a yearly fee, and I'm sure if I were to ask a whole bunch of questions throughout the year, they might change that, but
So $35,000 gives you unlimited access to them,
yep,
it's good,
yep.
including producing this?
That's pretty good.
Yeah, that's good.
A lot less than UBS.
Exactly. It sounds like more value too.
Especially right now with all the Gatsby's and stuff coming out,
Yeah.
they've been amazing.
Well, it's helpful that they can educate all of us as well, go through the process.
So going on to item 7,
No,
potential
Sorry.
future agenda items.
Up here.
Sorry.
He's ready to go.
Yeah, we're all ready to go.
Well, Bob just put the pension plan on there. That's probably a good idea.
Well, it kind of goes back to the resolution, right?
Yeah. We're doing the update on the resolution.
And
And
asking our
asset, the investment
Mhm.
modifications.
Tim is continuing to build out that investment report at some point. Do we circle back when it's complete or intermediate stages or?
At least, want to look at it.
What makes? In my sense is it doesn't make sense to go, well, we're almost there. And try to evaluate, we really want to see
wait till it's
in case
complete.
something
Yep.
pops up, because in that last 2%
Mhm.
that we didn't expect. Um,
so interim report.
Yeah, a status report or, maybe it's helpful.
I agree.
Even to have copies of what is filled in for now. Is that helpful or is?
I think it helps Ken, right? Because we don't want to build this thing all the way through and then having to take certain pieces apart and rebuild. I think the Excel spreadsheet too, I was going to do this, it has the calculations in there too, right?
Mhm.
Might take a look at those just as did anyone go through it just to make sure the calculations are perfect, sound?
No. But we're still putting in information of comparing it to the audits to make sure that they match.
That might be good exercise. It's because it's human error. I mean, human input,
Well,
human.
it's a huge problem. It's a huge potential, and that's why, we designed that to be structured, to be looked at with the audit, those historical data. Columns are in there for a specific reason, but,
One of the,
it's a big worry, for me about
Me
having
too.
that in Excel. Excel's it's not always a great production tool,
Been around a long time.
but I don't know anything else. You could go buy an Oracle system or something, but then you're gonna need a staff here that's running, running the thing and.
well, if you have general electric accounting system that has that built in, but you're talking about the different system altogether and lots of.
We've done a
Expense.
ton of spot checking on that document as well, so it's not. And there's a lot of symmetry in the way that it's designed, meaning if there's a formula error, it's probably gonna show up. It could show up in a whole lot of places, so numbers are gonna start looking real goofy real quick. But your point's a good one, and when Kim is done, I'd like to go back and really do a whole lot more spot checking on it.
Yeah, I'm happy to help there.
I think the problem is that, let's say that we put in a big project and we estimate doing away with the sewage treatment plant. And there's elements of that pump station, this pump station, and we forecast all of that sort of stuff. And then for some reason that part of it goes away.
Mhm.
Getting that stuff out and putting in the new sewage treatment plant or the next big cash thing. So I think there's some problem making sure that what's in and what's out
Yeah.
is known at a given point in time.
Well, I'm happy to dive into that and for amount of experience with it, so
I should probably say that
a lot of experience.
Kim and I worked through it, but I actually built the spreadsheet, so it's. It had that level, like you're going through a lot of the formulas and whatnot.
And even as I've been going through it, me and Mike have been having phone calls of
Yeah.
me not liking how this is coming and trying to.
But if you have a fluency with Excel, I would absolutely think it would be, I think Kim and I don't want to speak for Kim, but Kim and I would be very open to having a lot of eyeballs on it.
I think the more eyeballs, the better.
Yeah.
Questions. you have.
I think the real checks are gonna come when you start looking at the output and start saying, how could that number be? You know, where did that number come from? You got two extra zeros there, what, you know? Those kinds of things are gonna surface stuff if they show up. And I think when we start comparing it to the audit, and the budgeted numbers and things like that, it'll be. But if you want to dig through, you know, by all means, it's all explicitly laid out. It's very methodical.
Oh, yeah, I mean, might as well start now, and it might take some time to get through it all, depending on what's going on. I'm not sure how you want to do that. Is there a file you want to get in a thumb drive or something, or how you want to give that to me? So we can go through it?
I can email the file to you.
It's not that
Yeah.
large.
It's pretty large, but,
Yeah, maybe thumb drive. would be good.
yeah,
You can,
Yeah.
you can email it. I mean, it's,
Yeah.
you're all right with an email?
Yes, it works.
Kim and I go
Yeah, I
email
don't
back
know.
and forth the file all the time.
The entire file.
and then I'll just encrypt it.
Well, I don't think, you know, whatever you guys need to. We can do. 43 pages, we added another page.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing how sometimes you get the pace, like, I need that.
What could go wrong?
So just to be clear, the way
Yeah,
we
just
kind of,
43.
Kim and I sort of architected this, I built the structure, but Kim's responsibility is to really gather and input all the data elements, which are really important. And so both those need to be checked. And, you know, when Kim is going to give the accounting system a real push, you know, to get all this stuff done. But there's a lot of potential areas for question is, you know, one question is, and Kim was critical on this too, was, you know, did we model things correctly? You know, when you model the expenses of the electric company, the electric utility, did you get all the, I mean, Kim and I've gone back over and over on some of these things that, where's the plumbing?
Mhm.
The plumbing, permit guy go, where does it, did you know, I didn't know this, each one of the utilities buys electric from the electric utility. You know, where does that go? How do you model that? So we, you know, all those things had to be sort of thought through.
How's your comments on the behind the scenes? Do you have comments in those fields? I mean, you know, general ledger matching numbers, or how do you?
We have notes at the bottom for,
Are you?
instead of putting, because I was putting comments in of, and then you'd have to actually like hover over the cell and stuff, so we're putting notes at the bottom of the page. And we think we might even add like a notes page at the end.
Are you
Where you gonna
matching?
use
Are
your manual?
you matching entries with general ledger account numbers by any chance?
Yeah, so when I'm
On the
pulling the
spreadsheet.
information, I'm pulling it right from our accounting.
Okay, but does the spreadsheet contain those general ledger account numbers? The
No.
notes?
No,
Okay.
no, but to your point, and it's a good one, Kim and I have talked about almost having a user manual. That would specifically say this page number 3 is pulling from,
Yeah, exactly.
you know.
I was
Yeah.
thinking that
Yeah.
might be notes in the file.
Yeah.
But that's.
In an ideal world, and I don't think it's possible, but you would go to the accounting system providers and you'd say, this is the structure we have. Can we link this into the accounting system?
I do have a case open.
Oh, you do?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm not optimistic about it, but I do have a case open.
Okay. The thing with the accounting system is it's largely historical. And the bulk of that document is all in the future. So you might link to accounts, but you don't have the projected amounts of them, like, you know, the number of employees in the electric utility in 5 years from now.
Yeah, but at least you'll have the historical stuff. You don't have to key it in. You can just,
Yeah.
you just do a mass transfer, you know. Of the data. Okay, well, I mean, that should be fairly easy.
So then give it to him.
You're just doing an extract, right? It's like monthly extract and then matching up against the cells and the, I mean, you wouldn't have to worry about inputting that in the errors. potentially. So you're actually going in from the general ledger accounting system to get all the data and input it into the Excel spreadsheet.
So it's a few different reports that you have to run to get all the information that I need. And then it's combining those with like lookup functions and
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So
Like
maybe
you
the,
said,
maybe
should
maybe the
be-
vendor can help. You just need a file.
yeah, that's what
Okay.
I'm trying to work through is
Yeah,
if
great.
they can create something, even if they can put the size of a pipe on there by the account number instead of me having to run a whole different report and based on what they're being charged and
One of the things that becomes really clear as you start to work through these things is how complicated the pricing structure of these utilities are. How many different pipe sizes for irrigation for out of city user, and each one of those has its own price and you start to, me as a resident of the city starts to ask, do we need does it really need to be this complicated? But Kim and I weren't trying to say this is the way the world should be. We were trying to say this is the way the world is, and we're modeling it that way.
But then.
Just like we didn't come in here today to say, how big should your operating reserves be? How big should your capital reserves be? We just said, with the calculations that are out there, this is how big they are. And how should they be be
What can we
invested?
do? Yeah.
There's a different question, an important question is what should actually go into determining what those operating reserves are. That's a whole nother discussion.
But the structure, the architecture is gonna help identify that.
Yeah.
And identify, ooh, we didn't think about this, or this didn't pop up.
Mhm.
However diligently and many times we've gone over. Still popped up.
Yeah.
And it's useful. Maybe we don't need all these different sizes. But you can't begin to attack that aspect until you've really finished.
Yes, you have to lay it all out.
And then it's a whole different exercise and potential for, hey, here's something that really needs to be addressed.
And by the way, all
Here's
that-
where the numbers, here's the values that are popping up that help inform what our targets should be, or plus or minus.
But the reality of it is all those pipes are already in the ground, so we can't pull out the 1.25 inch pipes, and, merge them with a 1.5 inch pipe. But my point is, there's a lot of, you kind of wonder what people were, it's sort of like, you walk down and maybe Robin will disagree with me, but you walk down the aisle and there's Kellogg cornflakes. There's a 20-ounce box, a 21-ounce box, a 22-ounce box, a 23-ounce box, and they all have a different price on them.
Mhm.
And you're trying to figure out what the price of them is. You say, why don't they just have one box? It's 22. It's a little bit like that. I'm sure there's a rationale for it, but some of these things look overly complicated. Nevertheless, Kim and I modeled them as they are, not as they should be.
even going through it is like water usage is based on a inclining block. But then sewer, which is based off of water, is just based on a flat rate for residential, commercial, industrial. Like, why isn't water and sewer mirroring each other? And it's based on EDUs versus for the pipe size, it's.
Good God.
It really, you can't do it, because I think there's too much background now, but if you could really rethink the whole pricing structure of this utility, I think it could be so much simpler. But it is what it is. These EDUs, that was a whole modeling thing.
Yeah.
What was it, equivalent dwelling units? And we had that's one utility uses that, and another, it's just,
So you can take all this knowledge and become a consultant in this area now.
Yeah.
yeah.
And keep it that complicated, so they always need you.
Yeah. You know more about utilities now, Mike, and.
Than I ever wanted to know.
Okay. It is now 1:12.
Oh, okay.
And motion to adjourn.
Do we have another meeting scheduled?
Should we?
We can get back to you on that.
Okay.
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 Can Kim and Rob- can Kim
I'll
and
make
Rob
a
vote
motion
on
to
this?
adjourn
No.
I'll second him.
Okay, next meeting will be very interesting. Lots to talk about.
We are making good progress. Thank you all.